Ju-won was a man who had never experienced love in his entire life. The only people he truly had were his parents, but they also passed away in a tragic car accident on Christmas evening. Since then, every Christmas became another lonely day for him. While families gathered with their wives and children, he wandered the streets by himself, feeling more isolated than ever. Because of his tall build, people often avoided him, making the loneliness even harder to bear. As he walked through the cold streets, he noticed an old man dressed as Santa Claus sitting on the roadside and begging for money. Feeling sorry for him, Ju-won decided to give him some cash, instead of spending it on beer or junk food. The old man smiled warmly and asked, "Do you have any wish in life?" Ju-won found the question strange and tried to walk away, but the old man stopped him. Trying to avoid the conversation, Ju-won replied, "I wish to win the lottery." The old man shook his head and said, "That's not your real wish. Tell me what's hidden in your heart." Those words struck him deeply. After staying silent for a moment, he admitted, "I just want a happy family, a beautiful wife, and a cute daughter." The old man smiled confidently. "Your wish will come true. If I fail, then I don't deserve to be Santa." Ju-won simply thought the old man was crazy and left without another word. That night, he returned to his tiny apartment by train. Every passenger around him seemed to be sitting with their partner, making him feel even more alone. Unable to watch them any longer, he closed his eyes and fell asleep. He never expected that it would be the last sleep of his old life. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself inside a wooden cage on a moving carriage. Around him were several exhausted people who looked as though they had not eaten for days. He himself was in slightly better condition, but he had no clothes and shivered from the cold. Looking around, he heard soldiers speaking a language he couldn't understand. Heavy chains were locked around everyone's legs. It slowly dawned on him that he had become part of a slave caravan in another world. Instead of being hit by a truck like the heroes in novels, he couldn't help but think that the strange Santa Claus had somehow sent him here instead. Before he could process everything, the freezing wind made him tremble. His eyes landed on the body of a dead slave who still wore clothes. Feeling guilty but having no other choice, he quietly took them and put them on to survive the cold. Sitting back down, he wondered if becoming a slave was really the path toward the family he had wished for, or if that strange Santa had simply tricked him. For now, he could only hope it was all a dream, and that he would wake up back on Earth. Several days passed as the slave caravan continued its journey. Ju-won slowly adjusted to his miserable situation, but the lack of food had taken its toll. His cheeks became hollow, his hair messy, and his body weaker with every passing day. He desperately wished for the suffering to end. Whenever the caravan stopped at a village, the slaves were lined up to be sold. Seeing this, Ju-won found a small spark of hope. Although becoming someone's slave was terrible, at least he would receive food every day. He was also confident that his tall height and appearance would attract a wealthy buyer. Reality, however, was completely different. No one even glanced at him. Village after village, every other slave was sold, while he remained behind. Unable to endure the pain any longer, Ju-won grabbed a nearby fork and decided to end his own life. Just as he raised it toward his neck, someone suddenly reached out and stopped him. Standing before him was a beautiful woman holding a piece of bread. For a starving man, that simple piece of bread looked more delicious than anything he'd ever eaten before. The woman spoke to him, but Ju-won couldn't understand a single word. It wasn't only because of the language. He was completely distracted by her beauty and by the little girl standing quietly beside her. Earlier that day, inside a small and worn-down house, the woman, Liz, was eating dinner with the young girl. Their food was limited. Worried that the child would remain hungry, Liz quietly pushed her own share toward her.
The little girl smiled but divided it into 2 pieces and returned half to Liz. Before Liz could thank her, loud knocking echoed from outside. She opened the door and the village chief spoke from outside. "Don't open the door fully, just listen carefully." He explained that soldiers had arrived with slaves and that one of them would become her new husband. He also told her to prepare food because the soldiers would arrive by morning. The news shocked Liz. Her previous marriage had been a nightmare filled with violence and suffering. For a moment, she considered running away, but then she looked at the little girl. The child had already lost so much, and Liz couldn't bear to leave her alone. Sensing her sadness, the little girl hugged her tightly with her tiny arms. Liz held back her tears and gently put the child to bed. The girl still didn't even have a name. She feared that another marriage might bring both of them into another life of misery.
Liz's fear came from painful memories she could never forget. Long ago, her own father had sold her for nothing more than a rabbit skin. The man who bought her lived on the mountain, and before she could even settle into her new home, he started beating her for being too slow. Life never improved after that. Day after day, she endured abuse and suffering. The only light in that dark life was the little girl who stayed by her side like an angel. Then one day, after another violent outburst, the man left to hunt in the forest and never returned. Later, the village chief informed Liz that he'd been killed by a wild animal and his body was never found. For a moment, she felt relieved, but reality soon caught up with her. In those times, a woman without a husband had almost no way to survive alone. For the little girl's sake, Liz accepted that she would have to marry again. The next morning, she baked several pieces of bread and carried them outside where the slave caravans had stopped. There, she noticed a tall man trying to stab his own neck with a fork. The sight reminded her of the day she herself had almost given up on life. Without hesitation, she ran toward him and stopped him. Looking at his thin face and exhausted appearance, she silently offered him a piece of bread. Before she could say anything else, the village chief arrived. He ordered her to return home and leave the slave business to him. Liz and the little girl looked back one last time before leaving. Ju-won couldn't believe that someone had offered him food when he'd been ready to die. His attention was completely fixed on the bread, but before he could even eat it, the soldiers dragged him out of the cage and forced him to kneel beside 2 other slaves. A soldier pulled out a knife and cut their arms, letting blood drip onto 2 sheets of paper. The papers suddenly glowed with a faint blue light. Ju-won stared in shock. Was this magic? His curiosity about this strange world grew even stronger. After the contracts were completed, one soldier whispered something to the village chief. The chief nodded before walking over to inspect Ju-won. Meanwhile, Liz and the little girl returned to their house. Another village woman brought them supplies for several days and explained that Liz's new husband could not speak their language. Seeing the fear still on Liz's face, the woman tried to comfort her. She explained that although the man looked like an ordinary slave, his hands were as soft as those of a noble. She also reminded her that everyone in the village had disliked her previous husband. If her new husband could perform the duties of a mountain keeper, their future might finally be peaceful. Liz quietly replied, "I don't need him to be special. I only hope he isn't a violent man." Just then, the village chief opened the door and brought her new husband inside. Liz froze. It was the same man she had saved only moments earlier. Standing so close to him now, she finally realized just how tall and powerful he looked. Fear slowly crept into her heart once again. Ju-won also recognized Liz as the woman who had given him bread, but he had no idea why everyone around him was acting so strangely. Before he could understand the situation, the village chief grabbed his arm and placed him beside Liz and the little girl. Then he forcefully locked their arms together, making them stand like a newly married couple. Ju-won couldn't understand a single word they were saying, but from the situation alone, he realized that he was being married to the woman. He suddenly remembered the strange Santa. The old man had promised him a beautiful wife and a cute daughter. It seemed that promise had come true. Ju-won felt happy, but at the same time, he couldn't help feeling annoyed after everything he had gone through. He silently promised that if he ever met that Santa again, he would make him suffer just as much. His serious expression frightened both Liz and the little girl, who were already carrying painful memories from the past. Meanwhile, the village chief was pleased. The work of a mountain keeper required great strength, so he decided to test Ju-won. A villager stepped forward and challenged him to a handshake. Although Ju-won couldn't understand the words, he understood the intention and used all of his strength. The villager instantly regretted it. His hand almost broke, while Ju-won looked completely relaxed. Satisfied with his strength, the chief moved on to another test. He handed Ju-won a bow and pointed towards a wild rabbit. Ju-won had never used a bow before. He copied the posture he had once seen in Olympic competitions and released an arrow. The shot barely missed the rabbit. Even so, the village chief smiled and clapped as though he were satisfied. Ju-won remained completely confused. Soon after, Liz and the little girl approached him carrying a basket filled with food. Seeing Liz up close, Ju-won couldn't believe that such a beautiful woman was now his wife. His face turned red with embarrassment. The village chief noticed his reaction and realized that this tall man had probably never been close to a woman before. Smiling to himself, he left the three of them alone so they could get used to each other. Without anyone else nearby, Liz became even more nervous. Even so, she knew she had to fulfill her duties as a wife. She spread a cloth on the ground and carefully served food to Ju-won, the little girl, and herself. The meal was quiet and awkward. Ju-won wished he could introduce himself, but the language barrier made it impossible. He silently blamed the strange Santa again for throwing him into such a situation. Still, deep inside, he felt grateful. Without that mysterious old man, he would never have dreamed of having a family like this. After the meal ended, the village chief returned and led them towards the mountain where they would live. The path was steep and exhausting. Liz and the little girl struggled to keep walking. Seeing this, Ju-won decided to help. He walked towards Liz, causing her to panic as she wondered what he intended to do. Unable to explain himself, he simply lifted both Liz and the little girl into his arms and continued climbing the mountain. As he carried them, he realized just how light they were. They were clearly suffering from malnutrition. He quietly promised himself that one day they would eat good food and grow healthy and strong. Liz couldn't understand his thoughts, but she could feel his determination. Slowly, the fear in her heart began to fade. She even reached up and gently wiped the sweat from his face as they continued their climb together. Before long, they reached the mountain cabin that would become their new home. The small cabin was old and badly damaged. The moment Ju-won saw it, he shivered, realizing he might have to spend another freezing night. As he stepped inside, he found Liz standing silently with tears in her eyes. Confused, he wanted to ask what had happened. Before he could do anything, Liz ran past him and disappeared into the distance. After running for a while, she stopped beside a lake and finally let her emotions out. While they had been away, someone had broken into the cabin and stolen everything. Their bowls, table, bow, hammer, knife, farming tools, and even their hoe were all gone. Without those things, they couldn't repair the broken cabin or protect themselves from wild animals. Liz felt completely hopeless. Just then, Ju-won finally found her. Seeing her crying, he quietly sat beside her and gently placed his hand on her head. Although Liz couldn't understand his words, she could tell he was trying to comfort her. That simple gesture warmed her heart. Even so, she couldn't stop worrying. The cabin was falling apart, there was almost no food, and hunting would be impossible without proper tools. Ju-won didn't look like someone who had ever done hard labor before. Despite all those fears, something inside her felt strangely calm whenever he was near. The emotions she had buried for years finally overflowed, and tears rolled down her face once again. Ju-won let her cry. He softly spoke about his own past.
I lost my parents when I was young. Life felt hopeless, but I kept moving forward. I'm glad I did, because otherwise I would never have met you. I want to protect you and your daughter for the rest of my life. Liz couldn't understand the language, but she understood his kindness. Her guard finally disappeared. She stepped forward and hugged him tightly, releasing all the pain she had carried for so long. The little girl saw her mother crying and thought Juiwan had hurt her like her previous father had done. She quickly rushed over to protect Liz. Instead of pushing her away, Juiwan gently pulled the little girl into the embrace as well. He still didn't know who her real father was or why Liz had given him bread that day, but one thing was certain. They were his family now. He silently promised himself that he would become the best husband and the best father, giving them a life where they would never have to cry again. After sharing their emotions, the three of them returned to the cabin. The room became quiet as everyone sat awkwardly, unsure of what to say after everything that had happened. Finally, Juiwan decided to introduce himself. He slowly pronounced his name so they could understand it. Liz and the little girl quickly repeated it correctly. Then he pointed toward Liz, asking for her name. She smiled softly and introduced herself. Juiwan praised her beautiful name before looking at the little girl. She lowered her head and stayed silent. She had never been given a name. Liz explains that after her previous husband died, life had been too difficult to think about such things. Juiwan couldn't imagine someone living without a name. After thinking for a moment, he chose one himself. Dorothy. It was a name from one of his favorite stories, The Wizard of Oz. The little girl smiled happily as she accepted her new name. Juiwan smiled too, hoping that one day she would live as happily as the princesses in storybooks. Later that evening, Juiwan stood outside the cabin, splitting firewood for the night. A short distance away, Liz quietly watched him while thinking about everything that had happened that day. She softly whispered his name to herself. Even though it came from a language she didn't understand, she thought it sounded elegant. She couldn't help wondering who Juiwan really was and where he had come from. Since childhood, every man in her life had treated her badly, whether it was her father or her former husband. That was why she couldn't understand why Juiwan was so kind. While she remained lost in thought, Juiwan noticed her standing nearby. He smiled, waved at her, and happily called out, "Liz!" His voice pulled her back to reality. For the first time, she carefully looked at his face. His black hair and dark eyes reminded her of an old legend she had once heard. The story spoke of a hero summoned from another world, a man with black hair and black eyes. For a moment, she wondered if Juiwan could be that person. But she quickly dismissed the thought. No great hero would ever become a slave in such a poor village. Besides, as Juiwan came closer, she realized his hair and eyes looked more brown than black. He was simply a tall man who seemed different from everyone else. That thought eased her heart, although she felt embarrassed for thinking such strange things. Juiwan noticed the changing expressions on her face and couldn't help smiling. He gently patted her head. Liz closed her eyes and quietly enjoyed the warm touch. Her relaxed expression made her look even more adorable. Without thinking, Juiwan leaned forward and gave her a light kiss on the lips. Liz froze completely. She never expected something like that. Juiwan was equally shocked by his own actions. Embarrassed, he immediately turned around and hurried away. As he walked deeper into the forest, he scolded himself. He couldn't believe he had kissed Liz when they'd only known each other for a single day. Lost in thought, he suddenly realized he had wandered too far into the woods. Looking around, he searched for a way back. Then he felt a terrifying presence behind him. Slowly turning around, he saw a giant wolf standing only a short distance away. The beast was almost as large as he was. Fear rushed through his body. He quickly grabbed a stick from the ground and prepared himself. The wolf lunged at him without hesitation. Juiwan barely blocked the attack by placing the stick between them.
The teeth became stuck in the wood. Taking the advantage, Wan punched the wolf across the face. The furious beast bit down harder until the stick snapped into 2 pieces. Now defenseless, Wan had no choice but to attack first. He threw another punch, but the wolf caught his arm with its jaws, leaving a deep wound on his wrist. The pain burned through his arm. When he looked down, he saw something unbelievable. Real flames were rising from his injured arm. Wan stared in shock. Could this really be magic? The wolf seemed frightened by the fire as well and tried to retreat. Wan didn't give it the chance. He charged forward and struck the beast again and again with his burning fist until the wolf finally stopped moving. Exhausted, he collapsed onto the ground and struggled to catch his breath. Looking at his arm, he searched for the terrible wound that should have been there. But there wasn't even a scar.
Wan stared at his arm in disbelief. Only moments earlier, the wolf had bitten deeply into his wrist, yet now there wasn't even a scratch. He looked over his skin again and again, unable to find any wound. The only explanation he could think of was magic. Remembering the fantasy novels he had read back on Earth, he eagerly tried to use it again. He raised his hand and shouted, "Fireball!" Nothing happened. He tried again, "Firestorm!" Still nothing. Then he called out, "Firewall!" The forest remained silent. He even repeated several magical incantations he remembered from novels, but none of them worked. Eventually, he sighed and gave up. Even though he couldn't control it, he was certain that he possessed some kind of magical power. After all, the terrible wound on his arm had completely disappeared. Wan clenched his fist. If he could master this ability, he could become a stronger hunter and protect his family. He could even heal Liz and Dorothy whenever they were injured. There were no doctors on this mountain, so this power could save their lives. Wan quietly made himself another promise. He would become stronger and provide them with a better future. He never wanted to be called a curse again. Painful memories returned to his mind. After his parents died, his grandfather had taken him in because none of his relatives wanted him. But not long afterward, his grandfather also passed away. His cousins blamed him for everything. They beat him and called him an evil child who brought death wherever he went. He lifted the heavy animal onto his shoulders and carried it all the way back to the mountain cabin.
Meanwhile, Liz and Dorothy were preparing dinner. Suddenly, they noticed the head of a giant wolf outside the window. Dorothy screamed in fear. Liz immediately grabbed a knife to protect the little girl. As she looked more carefully, she finally realized it wasn't a monster attacking them. It was Wan carrying the wolf. Relieved, she hurried outside. Then she noticed the injuries on his face. Her expression quickly changed to worry. She rushed toward him and carefully examined him, believing he must have gone through a terrible battle. Wan smiled and tried to reassure her. "It's only a few scratches. I'm fine now." Although Liz couldn't understand the words, she could tell he was trying to calm her. Without hesitation, she wrapped her arms around him in a tight hug. Wan stood there in surprise. He never expected Liz to take the initiative. A moment later, Dorothy hugged his legs as well, trying to tell him how worried she had been. Even without understanding the language, Wan knew exactly how they felt. His heart grew heavy. He had promised himself that they would never cry again, yet on the very first day, he had already made them worry. The following morning, after everyone had calmed down, Wan began butchering the wolf. He remembered watching his grandfather prepare animals for special occasions, but doing it himself was much harder than it looked. Even so, he continued working, because his family needed food. While he worked, Liz entered the barn carrying a basket. She silently handed it to him so he could place the meat inside. Wan smiled gratefully and tried to thank her. His pronunciation sounded awkward, making Liz gently correct him until he said it properly. No one had ever thanked Liz before. Hearing those simple words filled her heart with warmth. She quietly realized that since meeting Wan, she had experienced many things for the first time, including hearing someone sincerely thank her. If you're enjoying Yuiwan's new life and the growing bond with his family, don't forget to follow for the next part, as their peaceful days continue to unfold.
As Liz watched Ju-won work, a thought quietly crossed her mind. She remembered their first kiss and wondered if it had also been his first. Had he ever kissed another woman before? The idea made her unexpectedly jealous. Her heart wandered for a moment before she quickly forced herself back to reality and continued helping him. Ju-won, however, wouldn't let her do the dirty work. He calmly handed the meat himself, leaving Liz even more confused. In her eyes, this kind of work belonged to women, yet he did it naturally without complaint. While she stood there thinking, Ju-won suddenly stepped closer. His face moved towards hers. Liz's heart began racing. She wondered if he was about to kiss her again. She instinctively closed her eyes. Instead, Ju-won gently kissed her forehead. Liz immediately realized she had misunderstood and felt embarrassed. Noticing her reaction, Ju-won leaned forward once more. This time, Liz forced herself to keep her eyes open. But Ju-won wasn't teasing her. He softly kissed her lips. Liz stood frozen in surprise. Then she noticed Dorothy nearby. Her face turned bright red with embarrassment. Unable to stay there any longer, she ran out of the barn as fast as she could. With Liz gone, Dorothy decided to help Ju-won instead. Her tiny hands weren't very useful, but Ju-won still smiled and thanked her for trying. The little girl beamed with happiness. After finishing his work, Ju-won carried the basket of meat into the cabin. The room smelled unpleasant because Liz was drying the wolf hide inside. At first, he didn't understand why she would keep it there. But after watching her carefully treat the skin, he realized how valuable it was. He understood that many ordinary things from his old world were precious in this one. Because of that, he knew he needed to learn more about money, trade, and how people lived here. Otherwise, he might easily be cheated in the future. While Liz continued working with the hide, Ju-won decided to head back into the forest. Liz immediately tried to stop him. She was worried he would get hurt again. Ju-won smiled reassuringly. "I'm only going to cut some trees. I'll be fine." Deep in the woods, he found a small tree and decided to practice chopping it down. He had heard that oak made excellent firewood, but he couldn't tell one tree from another. He tightened his grip on the axe and swung it. The axe slipped from his hands and flew away. Ju-won looked around in embarrassment to make sure nobody had seen him. After several hours of practice, he finally returned with a large bundle of firewood. Although he had promised Liz he would be careful, his hands and body were covered with small cuts from using the unfamiliar tool. Liz rushed over and quietly treated his wounds. Dorothy also wanted to help. She scooped water from a jar and splashed it toward him to cool him down. Most of the water ended up everywhere except on Ju-won. Even so, he laughed softly and patted her on the head. That evening, the family sat together for dinner. Liz served the wolf meat Ju-won had hunted. After such a long time without meat, everyone enjoyed the meal, especially Dorothy. She ate until she became sleepy and nearly fell asleep at the table. Ju-won gently picked her up and carried her to bed so she could sleep warmly through the night.
While Dorothy slept peacefully, Liz heated some water for Ju-won to wash away the dirt from the day's work. In this medieval world, it was a wife's duty to clean her husband. Holding a cloth wash, Liz carefully wiped his body. Ju-won quietly enjoyed the feeling of being cared for. Liz, however, became more and more embarrassed. His strong build kept distracting her, making it difficult to stay calm. Seeing her flustered expression, Ju-won gently took her hand and leaned closer. A soft kiss followed. The quiet moment soon became more intimate, and the newly married couple finally accepted each other's feelings. That night, Liz slept more peacefully than ever before. Since childhood, every night had been filled with fear. Her family had been poor, forcing everyone to sleep in the same room. Her father often abused her mother in front of the children, leaving painful memories that stayed with Liz for years. She had always feared that one day she would suffer the same fate. Instead, she met Ju-won. He treated her with kindness and cared for Dorothy like his own daughter. Every morning she woke to the sound of burning firewood keeping the cabin warm. Every morning she hoped to wake beside the gentle man who had changed her life. She knew that not every marriage was filled with happiness, so she treasured every peaceful moment they shared. The next morning, before sunrise, Liz quietly got out of bed and began her daily chores.
Even though she wanted to remain beside Juwan, she believed it was her responsibility to care for the household. Juwan, however, came from the modern world. He got up as well and started helping with the morning work. As he slowly learned the local language, he tried speaking simple words to Liz. One of those words was, honey. The word instantly made Liz blush. She was still not used to receiving so much affection. Juwan couldn't help teasing her when he saw her cheeks turn bright red. While the couple enjoyed the quiet morning together, Dorothy suddenly awoken. She hadn't awakened because of their voices. She had dreamed about meat all night. Afraid that it might disappear, she rushed toward the bucket where it had been stored. The moment she saw that the meat was still there, she smiled with relief. Watching Dorothy's happiness filled Juwan with determination. He wanted his family to eat meat whenever they wished. He no longer cared about the dangers waiting inside the forest. This time, instead of carrying only a stick, he picked up an axe before leaving the cabin. Holding it tightly, he walked deeper into the woods. As he moved through the trees, he suddenly sensed a heavy presence nearby. The feeling was even frightening than the wolf he had fought before. His grip tightened around the axe as he prepared himself for another dangerous battle. But when the figure finally stepped out from the shadows, it wasn't a beast. It was an old man wearing a hood.
As he approached, his eyes fell upon Jiwan's forearm. There, he noticed the faint mark left by a wolf bite. The old man froze. A wound that deep should have taken months to heal, if it healed at all. An ordinary villager would probably have died from infection, yet Jiwan stood before him completely healthy. The old man reached only one conclusion. Jiwan was a mage, and not just any mage, but someone with powerful healing abilities. Excitement filled his heart. For years, he had waited for an opportunity to fulfill his revenge. Now, he believed he had finally found it. Long ago, when he was still young, the hooded man became a mountain keeper under a noble. The position carried great responsibility, but it also offered the chance to earn honor during wartime and possibly rise above the life of a commoner. That dream brought him to these mountains. The nearby village was peaceful and rich with resources, but gathering firewood required entering the dangerous forest. One day, while working, he wandered too deep inside. There, he suffered terrible injuries and broke one of his legs. His dream of becoming a respected soldier ended that day. As he struggled to survive, he encountered goblins. The monsters kidnapped human women and forced them to bear their children. The old man barely escaped with his life. Because of his injuries, he was forced to retire and spend the rest of his years in the village. Yet for 20 long years, his hatred for the goblins never disappeared. He waited for someone strong enough to destroy them. Now, standing before Jiwan, he believed that person had finally appeared. Jiwan possessed a powerful body, incredible healing, and possibly magic. The old man decided that he would teach him everything he knew and turn him into the strongest hunter. For some time, both men simply observed each other. Then the old hooded man finally spoke. "I want to take you as my student and teach you everything I know." Jiwan couldn't understand the words, but he could tell the old man wanted something from him. The following morning, Jiwan prepared to leave for training. Even though he accepted the old man's guidance, he still didn't trust him. The stranger reminded him of the greedy manager from his previous life. Because of that, he decided to keep the old man away from Liz and Dorothy. Before leaving, Liz packed him a simple lunch. Jiwan smiled warmly as he looked at Liz and Dorothy seeing him off. To many people, it would have been an ordinary morning, but for Jiwan, who had once lived completely alone, it felt like the greatest blessing in the world. That was exactly why he wanted to become stronger. He wanted to protect the family he had finally found. The old hunter led Jiwan deep into the forest. Without saying much, he walked in a strange pattern that seemed completely random. He then signaled for Jiwan to follow his footsteps. Jiwan carefully copied every movement, wondering if this was some kind of special footwork like the martial arts techniques he had read about in comics. The old man watched with a faint smile as Jiwan awkwardly tried to imitate him. After teaching him how to leave confusing tracks, the old hunter moved on to other survival skills. He showed Ju-on how to recognize different trees by their appearance and texture. He taught him how to memorize paths through the forest and how to find his way back if he ever became lost. He also explained how to rely on his eyes and ears while traveling through the woods and how to avoid dangerous animals and hunters. The training continued until they reached a cliff. The old man allowed Ju-on a short break. Happy to finally rest, Ju-on took out the lunch Liz had prepared that morning. Inside the box was a fried egg and several pieces of steak. Just as he was about to eat, the old hunter stopped him. "Close the box." The old man explained that the smell of cooked food could attract wild animals. Although disappointed, Ju-on obediently packed away the meal. Rules were rules. The two of them continued walking until they finally reached a small wooden hut hidden deep in the mountains. It was the old hunter's home. The old man entered the hut and returned carrying a large bow. He handed it to Ju-on. Ju-on had never seen such a bow before and wondered how anyone could even pull its string. Without saying a word, the old man drew the bow with ease and released an arrow. The arrow struck a tree with such force that it nearly pierced straight through it. Ju-on stared in amazement. The old man then handed the bow back to Ju-on and motioned for him to try it. Having never used such a weapon before, Ju-on struggled to hold it properly. Patiently, the old hunter corrected his posture and adjusted every mistake. Step by step, Ju-on slowly improved. Although inexperienced, he learned quickly and gradually became more comfortable with the weapon. While Ju-on trained in the forest, Dorothy suddenly woke up from a frightening dream. She dreamt that Liz and Ju-on had abandoned her, just as the people from her past had done. Terrified, she jumped out of bed and searched the cabin. She couldn't find Liz anywhere. Fear filled her heart again. She hurried to check the bucket of meat and, seeing it still there, calmed her a little. Even so, she continued looking for Liz. Then she heard loud voices outside. Quietly peeking through the window, Dorothy saw 3 village men surrounding Liz. She recognized them. They were the same men who used to bully Liz when her former husband was alive. Dorothy's heart filled with fear as she watched them argue with her mother. Liz tried to explain that she had stolen nothing and that all the meat belonged to her husband, who had hunted the wolf himself. The men refused to believe her. They called her a witch who had brought misfortune to both her previous husband and her new one. Ignoring everything she said, they pushed her aside and entered the cabin. Inside, they found the wolf hide and the bucket full of cured meat. The valuable hide excited them, while the amount of meat made them doubt that a slave could have hunted such a beast alone. They decided to take everything. Liz stepped in front of them and refused to let them steal her husband's belongings. Her courage only made the men angrier. One of them knocked her to the ground, while the others gathered the supplies. As Liz struggled to stand, she noticed Dorothy hiding beneath the bed. She knew the child would be in danger if they searched further. While she worried, one of the men asked what would happen if the mountain keeper discovered what they had done. Another laughed and replied that they could simply silence Liz and burn down the cabin. Since Ju-on couldn't understand their language, nobody would ever know the truth. Hiding beneath the bed, Dorothy watched in terror as they dragged Liz away. The moment they left, she ran outside crying Ju-on's name, hoping he would somehow hear her. Meanwhile, Ju-on had just finished another day of training with the old hunter. As he prepared to return home, he suddenly heard a child's desperate cries echoing through the forest. Without hesitation, he ran toward the cabin. On the way, he found the 3 men forcing Dorothy along with them. The sight drove him into a rage. He charged forward and knocked the first man unconscious with a single punch. The second received a powerful knee strike that sent him crashing backward. The third attacked from the side, but Ju-on dodged and slammed him onto the ground before striking him as well. His anger nearly consumed him. Just as he was about to break the man's arm, the old hunter stopped him. The old man reminded him that Dorothy was watching everything. Those words instantly brought Ju-on back to his senses. He looked toward Liz, afraid that she might now fear him just like the violent man from her past. Liz admitted to herself that seeing him fight had frightened her. For a brief moment, she remembered her former husband. But when she looked into Juiwan's eyes, she saw only concern for his family. Her fear disappeared. She gently took his hand and placed it against her cheek, silently thanking him for protecting them. Juiwan embraced Liz. Moments later, both of them rushed toward Dorothy, who was still trembling from everything she had witnessed. Dorothy tearfully apologized for hiding instead of helping. Liz immediately hugged her tightly. She assured her that hiding had been the right decision and that she had done nothing wrong. The little girl slowly calmed, though she still seemed nervous around Juiwan. Liz smiled softly and explained that Juiwan was now her father. Dorothy looked at Juiwan with shining eyes before happily running into his arms and calling him Daddy. Although he couldn't understand the word, Juiwan felt exactly what she meant. He lifted Dorothy into his arms and held her tightly. The family finally shared a peaceful moment together. Dorothy soon noticed the bucket of meat the robbers had tried to steal and hurried over to check it. Finding everything safe, she smiled with relief. Juiwan and Liz couldn't help but laugh at her love for meat. Even so, Juiwan knew there was still something left to do. He walked toward the unconscious robbers, but the old hunter stopped him once more. The old man advised him not to kill or further injure them. Instead, he suggested taking their tools as compensation. Juiwan accepted the advice, collected the tools, and silently warned the men never to cross his family's path again.
That night, after everything had settled down, Juiwan carefully examined Liz's face. Ever since fighting the wolf, he had wondered if he could use the strange healing power again. He gently placed his hand over her injuries and focused. To his surprise, the bruises slowly disappeared before his eyes. His healing magic had worked. Happy with the result, he spent the rest of the evening beside Liz, grateful that she was safe. The next morning, the village was busy preparing for the coming harvest festival. Inside the village chief's house, the village chief's wife complained loudly after discovering that her husband had given away the fabric she had saved for years. The chief calmly explained that the village desperately needed a capable mountain keeper, and Juiwan was worth the investment. He even suggested that Liz might one day trade rabbit pelts with them at a good price. His wife finally accepted his explanation and left. The village chief's smile slowly changed. He had hidden the real reason from everyone. He had noticed the wolf bite on Juiwan's arm, yet the wound had completely healed. Only healing magic could perform such a miracle. To him, Juiwan was a valuable healing mage. Greed filled his heart as he imagined selling Juiwan to a wealthy noble for a fortune and leaving the village behind forever. Only he and the old hunter Gus knew about this secret. Back at the mountain cabin, Juiwan remained completely unaware of their plans. He simply watched Liz happily sorting through the fabric she had received. Her excitement made him smile. Leaving her to enjoy herself, he headed into the forest to meet Gus. The old hunter had promised that today they would hunt rabbits. Juiwan felt strangely conflicted. The small animals reminded him too much of Liz and Dorothy, and Juiwan's mysterious powers were beginning to attract attention that could change his life forever. If you enjoyed this fantasy adventure, don't forget to follow for the next chapter and see how Juiwan faces the dangers waiting in both the forest and the village.